Welcome to Cross Platform Podcast, where we discuss how to solve productivity problems across platforms. I'm Augusto Pinaud,
And I'm Art Gelwicks.
and today we're talking about automation, but not necessarily what automation is or the definitions. We want to show some of the basics things that we do that are automation and some of the more fun ones that we do and that are set up for us to do.
Yeah, this is piggybacking off of our conversation from last week, talking about voice assistants and how they work and how they help us out. And there is this logical growth into, well, if I can make the computer do this, excuse me, can I make it do more for me? How far down the path can I turn over responsibility to the computer so that I can focus on the things that the computer doesn't do well? And if we think about it, just setting the tone right away, automation can be summed up in the premise that computers are very good at doing the same job over and over and over and over again. That is their extremely purpose cadence in life, is to be
Mhm.
able to repeat a sequence exactly. So if we look at the type of work we're doing, we can separate that out. We can say what are the things that we're doing over and over and over again? And are they something that could be turned into something the computer could handle for us? And we were talking about this in the pre-show. Often we think about automation as this like really complicated thing, big engines, lots of logic and flow charts and things like that. But I think a lot of the automation can be very simple and it can take care of the minutia that we have during the day. And the example that I brought up during the pre-show was if you think about in your email client, for example, you may have set up rules in your email to say all the emails that come from a specific email address go into this folder. Well, that's an automation. For all intents and purposes, that's an automation because it is doing the same job over and over again. It gets emails in, it looks at the email address and says, if it matches, then put it over here and lather, rinse, repeat, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and
But we don't, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you think on things like Dropbox or iCloud or Google Drive, there is an automation on the sense that it replicates to your devices. You can access that thing. You remember when you have the pen drive, where is the last file? Well, that is the answer of that automation. Where is the last file? Right there. As far as you synchronize that device or the device to the cloud, your cloud will propagate everywhere. And the reason of these examples is because when I mention automation, people tend to think on very complicated things.
Mhm.
And they think, oh, well, I don't know enough technology to use automation. No, no, you do. And this is the reason we wanted to bring it to this show.
Yeah, I like the idea of taking automation and doing it from a very straightforward perspective and then building up from there. I've always been a fan of kind of the stepped approach of automation. So, one of the things that I like to automate, for lack of a better term, is social media posts. If I'm going to, let's say, promote this episode, um, the last thing I want to have to do is build out the promotion and then manually trigger it to go into the places it's supposed to go.
Mhm.
It doesn't make any sense because I may not want it to happen until a later time. And that's one of the underlying pieces of automation is that automation does not have to happen at the time you are triggering it. It can happen in the future. That's one of its biggest strengths. So when we talk about something like social media or we talk about something like mail forwarding, those types of things where you can schedule it in the future means that that work is technically done. You've turned it over to the responsible party. In this case, it happens to be the automation routine to finish the path, to finish the task out. And I like doing that. But it does, again, go back to that requirement of do you understand what you're doing enough to be able to explain it to the computer? Why I stress that is because there's always these little goofy edge cases. There's always, it's this way all the time, except when it's not this way. Well, that's when automation kind of falls on its face, when it can't handle those edge cases. And that's what I think a lot of people get into a problem with. They try to create too complex of automations to simplify their steps. So when you think about the types of things that you have automated, and we say simple automations, what are some examples within your daily environment that you would consider an automated activity? I can't hear you.
We use an Amazon device, and that is the first and basic automation we have. And at the end of the day, we call them Miss A,
Hmm.
turn good night. Okay. And there is a series of routines that basically she goes, turn all the lights, make sure that the lock is engaged or engage the lock. Okay. And at the end, it said a comment. Okay. Have a good night. It's a random sentence from them. But it's the way that I know, oh, the process wrong completely, because
Okay.
I want to know you didn't fail. Okay? If you didn't respond to me, I know you failed. Okay. Same thing in the morning when it's time for the kids to wake up. There is another automation routine that says wake up the kids and do a bunch of things, a bunch of routines. This is a very simple. Amazon make it very, very simple to do that. The other thing I do is I journal. Okay, I'm a big
Hmm.
journaler, and I have a routine that is about gratitude. Okay, and I run that automation twice a day. And basically, I open it and it will ask me a series of questions. Okay. And then it will go get the series of questions and put them in my journal application. Why I do it that way instead of open the journal application? Because it allows me to do the question and format it. Okay. So that way, when it pastes, I don't need to ask the questions. I also do from Marshall Goldsmith. He, in the book, What Took You Here Will Not Take You There, he has a series of questions. And Goldsmith tells the story that he pays a virtual assistant just to call him every day. So he goes into, read the questions and he can give them the answer, and this person documented. And I was looking at that and say, well, but I don't need to hire an assistant. I thought the value on the process. And I said, okay, I don't want to hire an assistant for that. Can I do it with automation? And using my iPad and shortcuts, I create one that basically do that. Ask me the questions one at a time, and at the end, paste it. And later on, I found an accountability partner. Okay. And then it pasted and send it to the accountability partner, and the accountability partner do the same. But in my case, it's all all that I need to do is initiate the automation. It will ask me the questions, I will type, and then it will put it on the journal application and email or text to this person what are the answers to this. So, those are simple examples of automation that you can use. Another one that requires zero of you is we have three or four points on our household lights that are motion detection. Okay. So you don't need to get to the switch to turn on. My office has a light in front of me who is motion detection. My When you get down to the basement, the light on the bottom of the stairs is motion, because as soon as you open there and start moving, it will turn on. There is no reason to find the switch, and it will make sure that it turn off. So all those are examples of simple automations that sometimes people don't consider them as automations.
Yeah, I agree with you. You brought up a couple of interesting points there. Uh, Automation acknowledgement, at least successful completion acknowledgement, and also failure, is a critical part of any automation that you create, no matter if you've created it today or you've been running it for years. Having the ability for the automation to tell you that it finished its job successfully or it had a problem, That's the only way you develop confidence in these types of automations, because otherwise they're black box. You don't know what's going on. I had to build one about 2 years ago that had to run overnight and managed a couple thousand records on an import each night. Well, I needed confirmation that every step in that process happened for two reasons. One, because at the end of the process, all that data had to be available by the next morning. But more importantly, by creating checks all throughout the automation, and this is a longer one. This isn't the short ones that we were talking about earlier, but creating checks points at each step helped me to determine very quickly where did that automation fail. And that's something that I think everyone needs to consider when they're looking at automating their own processes is assume it's going to fail at some point. Something is going to happen to cause that automation to fail. And you should, one, know, well, what's the worst thing that happens if it does fail? And two, how do you recover from a failure state? What's the process involved? In this particular data load that I was talking about, it required, if it was a failure midway through, I had to actually purge out all the records that had been loaded to that point and then start it over from scratch. So I'd have to know how much time that was going to take. These are the types of things that when we talk about something as simple as email routing, creating an email rule, well, what can happen if that automation fails? Could it go to the wrong folder? Could it not be moved at all? What are those use cases, those edge cases, and how are you going to handle those when they occur? Not if, but when. Assume they will at some point. The other part is the creation of some sort of an audit trail. Now, audit trails usually are necessary for validation after the fact, but they can also give you good insight as to whether or not you have an efficient automation. I've built automations in the past where I've duplicated the steps in the process that I'm doing every day, and I've been able to build it into an automation, and it does exactly what I would do. But then afterwards, I go back and I look at the audit trail and I look at those steps and I realize that I wasn't doing it in the most efficient way in the first place. And it gives me that insight into my process to say, hey, I don't have to do all these steps. I can accomplish this in 2 steps and problem solved and get to the same end result. And I think automation is one of those opportunities to put a lens on the way we work and decide, are we being efficient and effective in these types of tasks and activities? Now, there's lots of tools out there for this. What tools do you use aside from, like, we talked about email rules, but are there any third-party tools or dedicated tools that you use to set up automations? And if so, how?
So my automations are very simple. I do automations in the Amazon devices, and I do automations on shortcuts in the iPad. So on top of that, I do the email rules and these kind of things. I also for the Mac, I have an application called Hazel, HACEL, that allows you to do some basic automations, and it's great. I can tell them, for example, check the download folder on my iCloud, and whatever has more than X amount of weeks, delete. Okay, or move to this
Okay.
folder and then delete. I can tell the download folders, those things. I can say, you know what? For example, the iCloud, it works beautifully for synchronized stuff, but the backup is, I don't trust it as much as I trust others. So I have a Hazel routine that basically goes and said any document created on my iCloud, back it up. Okay, so I don't
Okay.
need to worry about when that happened. Okay, and it sends me an email that I never read. Okay, so if that failed, I will never know. It has the email, but I never read it. But it sent me an emails of what was backed up during the week. That as I'm laughing at this, I'm thinking I should do a better job reading that email. But
Mhm.
it does it automatically. I don't need to think about it. I don't need to worry about it. And so those kind of things, same thing with the ebooks. I like my ebooks. I have a Kindle, and I get, because of what I do, a lot of advanced readers copies and those kind of books, that are not yet in the market, and you're getting the reader's copy or an early copy of
Mhm.
them. So I have a folder that basically anything that I put in there, it's automated, so it gets exported to the Kindle format and then pushed to my Kindle library. So as soon as I get the email, I just need to download it, put it in that folder, and it will
Right.
show up into my Kindle.
Yeah, there's three main applications that I use on the outside. One is IFTTT, if this then that, which has been around for a long time, and it's a
Mhm.
fairly straightforward tool for creating automated routines. You can use it uses connectors to connect between applications, and then allows you to actually go through and say, if something happens over here, then do something over here. Uh, Works really well, pretty robust. It's got some nice features like being able to create a button that triggers an automation. Uh, the second one I use, not as much, but it's much more powerful, is a tool called Zapier. Zapier does the same type of thing, but it has
Mhm.
many more connectors. It is a bit more expensive. And being a Microsoft guy and using Microsoft forever, I actually use a tool called Power Automate, which is something that's included in Microsoft 365 that allows you to build a lot of automations. It is very powerful. It is not the easiest thing in the world to learn how to use, but once you learn how to use it, you can do some really fascinating things with it. Uh, Specifically, I use it tied to Microsoft SharePoint to trigger automations and do things based on changes in data. So,
Mhm.
for example, if I create a record that says that I have a support ticket that's come in for a client that needs to handle a problem with their phone system, I have an automation that runs in there that will move it to the correct queue to mark it for the correct date and time and priority. Excuse me, priority, and basically handles it like an administrator. It makes my life much easier because otherwise I would need to do that on my own. They're very powerful tools, but they do take a lot of work. But it's interesting because this ties together with what we were talking about earlier. You talk about that email you don't read. One of the things that you can do is you can combine automations. You can leverage one automation off of the other. So if you have this email notification that's coming and saying that this ran successfully or this failed, you know, for this reason or whatever, if it's something consistent in the subject line of the email, most email rules can be set to read that subject line.
Mhm.
So you could have a rule in your email looking for those emails that you never read and looking for the specific ones that you really should read and actually be able to flag them and prioritize them differently and move them to different inboxes. You can combine those together. So there's a lot of capability when it comes to these types of things. You have to decide, though, where's the give and take on the effort necessary to automate something? Are you
Right.
going to put in so much effort to automate something when you could either A, simplify it, or B, just do it and get it done with? I have found, and maybe you agree or disagree with this, I have found there's two camps of automation, of things that compel automations. One are the things that you do all the time. And the other one are the things that you rarely do. So, for example, if there's a cleanup or a purge or a series of updates or something like that that you do every day, that's a good candidate for an automation because you want it to be consistent and reliable.
Right.
The flip side, though, if there's something that you do only every 6 months, but you're doing it the exact same way, creating an automation from that means that you can just go and hit that button and you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to remember those steps. You don't have to document those steps as to the same level. Um, I'd say it's a less frequent category, but for the infrequent things, especially the things that are like monthly, I find it can be really useful.
But I will give you a perfect example for that you're saying. Okay, in my tasks, okay, there is a repeat event. Okay, and repeat event are a simple way of automation. Okay, you may, and again, it's a matter of how you define it. But when you set those events, but that over the years has allowed me to create. I have two lists or two projects. One is prepare the house for winter. The other one is prepare the house for the summer. Okay, in the winter, things like disconnect the hose. Okay, well, why? No, sounds silly, but I'm very glad every time that thing shows him to the thing. Oh, I get to disconnect. It's good. Hasn't frozen yet, but it is a way of automation to remember you to do and to check all these things, or at least to go to the checklist. Okay, so you can do all these things and remind you. It works as if you have an assistant who goes to you and say, "Hey, Art, remember the host. Don't let that thing froze on you," and that's very very useful.
Do you consider reminders a form of automation?
When you can set them in the long run, yes. So, for example, there is one that runs into our system in the family. My kid had a guitar class every Tuesday. So
Mhm.
at the beginning of the thing was every Tuesday. Do you remember the guitar? Did you bring the guitar? Then it's annoying. So I set up now an automation. Okay. And as soon as certain things happen in the system, okay, the Amazon device do an announcement. Okay, Tomas, don't forget your guitar.
Mhm.
Okay. And I don't need to do it anymore. It works great. Okay, but it is automation. It is automated. And the same way the trash can. Okay, he needs, part of his responsibilities is to bring the trash can. I take it out, but he needs to bring it in.
Mhm.
And Wednesday, okay, at 3:30, he gets a message every week, and in his own device. Okay, and is that automation? Yes. This it's safe. It's an act, something that need to be repeated every week that I don't need to do anymore, and the computer is doing. And the computer do not get annoyed as a parent needed to repeat every Wednesday again. Did you bring the trash can in?
Right. No, I completely agree. That those kinds of steps, and when you look at most of the larger tools, when you look at something like an IFTTT or a Zapier, they're step based. So they're taking the basic things, this application or whatever, something's going to happen there. And when that something happens, go do something else. Once you've completed that, move to the next step.
Mhm.
Where it gets a little bit more complex is when you can do in programming parlance an if then else. If it's this thing, do this.
Mhm.
Otherwise, do this other thing.
Do this other thing.
And you start to create that nested logic. That's when people start to run into some issues with building automations because that logic can get very complicated.
Mhm.
And I think one of the biggest strengths of automation is it reveals to you how dysfunctional your processes actually are. Because if you think about the things that you're doing, how often are you dealing with those processes built in failures, their inability to handle changes in the situation? Well, if you have to handle it on the fly, your automation is not going to be able to do that. It has a choice. It can either run or it can fail. So you have to look very carefully at like what steps can I automate and can you mix and match them? The final thing that I see all the time is that people want to turn automations into this giant long sequence of events, this Chinese dragon that runs for miles. It doesn't have to be that way. You can take your steps in a process and decide that step 2, 5, and 7 are going to be automated.
Mhm.
It doesn't have to be 1 through 12 as one
Correct.
giant process that does all the work for you because automation is not good at that. But automation can take those times where you just need to, crank the widget and it'll do that for you. It's like, oh yeah, sure, no problem. I got this part. I got this part. But that's all you can ask of it. And then it's the handoff of that information, that transition. So I like being able to do that with the tools. It can be a little challenging to recognize when you have those opportunities, but that I think goes back to the one message that we say all the time. Learn your tools. Take the tools that you use most frequently, go into the automation tools or go into those tools and see, do they offer automation capabilities? Use Outlook, go learn how the rules work. If you want to use IFTTT, fine, then go into it and immediately search for the applications you use all the time. Look for the Todoist in the list. Look for, Microsoft Word, look for Excel, look for the things that you use and say, are there triggers in this tool that would allow me to automate things? Find out what those triggers are and then look at your processes and say, okay, when does that type of thing happen in my process? It's not it's not simple. It's not something you can just flip a switch and all of a sudden all your problems go away. But it is one of those things that if nothing else, it'll give you great insight into how you actually work. And maybe that's all it takes. You may find you don't need to automate anything. You just need to make it simpler.
I think that's the thing that is important. You may not need to automate anything, or you may discover, oh, wow, you know what? I've been doing this so complicated for the years, and now I can simplify it. I remember many years back when I switched to be iPad only, that was one of the things. How many of those automated on my brain process needed to change? For example, send an email. At the time, you could not attach an email or a file to an email. You needed to start from the file, then export it so you can email it. Now you can, but at that time you could not. So that means that you needed to change and evaluate the way you were doing things. And that was incredibly useful at that time. And it was one of those things that, hey, look what you do. I know people who do those routines, and it's very easy to find help to build those routines. If you are not, there is Fiverr, and there is people in Fiverr who can help you build for $5 or $10 those routines. And $5 or $10 may sound, oh well, but if I do 10, it's now $50. True, but if you do 10 and they work, how much they will save you in time, in
Mm-hmm.
effort,
Time, yeah, time, accuracy, rework. I agree with you completely.
you
It's
know.
it's a
I
worthwhile investment at that point.
I love when I sit in bed, okay, and say, Lady A, good night, okay, and I could hear, and then says the message. Okay, it is great. Why? Because for the previous God knows how many years, okay, what it was I was finally getting to bed and say, oh, are all the lights off? Are all the doors locked? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
let me stand up again. Okay, now it happened all automatically. Those things it are valid for me. $5, no question
Yeah.
about it. Not only that, remember, it may cost you $5, but it's a one-time deal, and then it will work. So
So here's a suggestion I'm going to throw out, and I was just playing with it as we were talking. One of the challenges that you get into when we talk about our favorite tools is that often it's a catch-22 with a tool. Microsoft To Do versus Todoist. Two to-do applications, they do great things, they have lots of functionality. But if I want to automate one, Todoist is the far better choice.
mhm.
Not because it's the better program, but because there are more automations available to work with it. So if I look in IFTTT, for example, and I look at Microsoft To Do triggers, things that can happen in To Do that will start an automation, there's one, and that's the completion of something in the task list. If I do the exact same thing for Todoist, there's 5 different triggers, 5 different things that can happen in Todoist to start an automation. I can create a new task. I can create a new task with a specific label. I can complete a new task. I can complete a new task that has a specific label, and I can create a new task in a section. All of those could start an automation. So if I really want to automate, I may have to decide that the task management tool I use has to support strong automation capabilities. And that could be a significant deciding factor in what tool I utilize. So, thinking about that, we often get ourselves into a bind because we'll say, oh, I like this tool. Now I want everything to automate it. Well, it may not have been the best tool to choose if automation is a key driver for what you're trying to accomplish. And I'll admit, OneNote, one of my favorite applications, doesn't do automation really well. It doesn't have a lot of external hooks, which makes it very limited in what it can do. Something like Evernote, loaded with external hooks. So I can automate a lot more things over there. So if that were a critical thing to me, I would need to make that decision as part of my tool set. It's something we always need to take into consideration. What is the short term? What's the availability of the capability? But also what is its long-term growth? And are we going to see this functionality come to be? Um, I'm not counting on seeing this functionality come to be anytime soon uh, with things like Microsoft Todoist, but it could be. You never know.
But it's you make an example that I understand not everybody will not apply to everybody, but I will tell you for me, because of the work I do, some clients live in one platform or the other, and that's how they manage the projects. Okay, and when you live in a certain project manager and your client lives in other, it's challenging. Okay, now so things like Zapier can tell you. I use one called Plixie. I have a client who they work on Asana, and it connects Asana with Todoist, and then everything gets moved into Todoist. So yes, I can go to Asana and work in there that I don't necessarily enjoy, or I can get everything synced to my world and then work from there. So those are the things that again will save you time. For example, and this is again an automation that a lot of people have. You can go to and say, when I receive an email from Art, I want to get a notification. Okay, it's
Mm-hmm.
simple. Okay, why? Well, because emails from Art are important, so I want to make sure I get that notification. And those are the kind of things. Look at that as your assistant helping you on those tasks that are possible to automate.
Yeah, it's really, I can't overstate enough taking the time to understand what the applications that you're trying to automate can and can't trigger. And it varies based on the automation tool. Um, when you take something like, for example, if I take Outlook and OneNote, they're both Microsoft products. If I want to automate them, I am most likely best served using something like Power Automate. Why? Because it's Microsoft's automation. The hooks are going to be there. Zapier would be the next tier down because it's much more complicated. But then I have to think about, well, what could I do in the application that I would want to trigger something to happen? And is that something that is a viable trigger? This again is where I think automation can be really powerful, but it can also be very time consuming. And you have to think about it with incremental gains. Um, the other thing that I found, and I'll just throw this out real quick, I actually have a tendency to forget I've created automations. I'll go in and I'll create an automation for a use case and, oh yeah, this will be great, and use it for a bit. And I completely forget it's in there. I've actually had problems troubleshooting specific issues in my systems, then to go back and figure out that I still had an old automation running that was breaking my new set of rules. So documenting your automations, where are you putting them in? What are the triggers? What are the behaviors? Having a record of that is really important to be able to say, okay, I know how this is going to function. But there's no question in my mind, people can save a concerted amount of time with an automation. So let me ask you one more question before we kind of put a bow on this thing for today. Of all the activities you have that you do right now, is there one that if you could automate it, you would? You just haven't looked at it yet. Nope.
Can somebody pick the kids to school and drop them up every day? No,
Okay,
that's
that's a whole different type of automation.
no. But for example,
That's
I
Ubermation.
that's overmation. I can tell you one that I created yesterday. I I create a new office. So I have a new office. The office outside on the backyard, and I don't know yet. Okay, winter is coming. I don't know how the weather is going to be. So when I came yesterday morning, it was a 60 degrees, and said, oh, okay, 60 is fine. It's a little bit cold, but I don't know yet the thermostat very well. So I'm trying to work into this thing. And I said, okay, well, let me, raise it up a little bit. And I said, okay, what do I need to know? And say, well, if the office is 60, I don't mind. I can come in the morning. But where is the threshold that I want to be alerted? I say, okay, if it
Okay.
goes below 50, I want to go because I will not be able to come here and work into this office at 5 in the morning. If it's at 50, I will froze. So what I
Okay.
did was I create an automation where the the lady Amazon is
Hmm.
checking what is the temperature of this room, and if it goes below 50, it will do an announcement. I know that announcement will come at 3 in the morning, and my wife will get very mad at me. But hopefully, it doesn't happen.
Yeah, I've been looking at that's a great one because it's actually very similar to one that I want to put into place in my office. I have electric baseboard heating. I have a dedicated baseboard unit that heats up my office, and it has one of the old style dial thermostats mounted on the baseboard that
Yes,
doesn't
that's the
tell the
problem I have.
temperature.
Hmm.
Yeah, it doesn't tell the temperature. It's just a pot thermostat. So I would love to hook a digital one up to it, but apparently nobody makes them that aren't wired into the house. So I'm going to have to either rig something else up or come up with some smart solution. So that from a
Well,
physical
we
perspective,
have now another episode that we can talk because I have
yes.
exactly the same issue. It is a dial thing and it
Yeah.
doesn't work automatically. I just want it. If I get that, I can kill the other thing.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, what I'm thinking is that, or the other thing that I would like to automate, and I haven't, and I know there's lots of apps to do it. And this is one of the things that I think automation is big for, is avoiding having yet another app, a dedicated app to do this little thing and that little thing and that little thing. If you can use an automation to utilize the bigger tools that you have, you might as well do it. The thing that I want to automate is my capture of transitions in time as I'm working on things during the day. So, for example, if I start at 8 o'clock in my office and I work from 8 to 8:30 on something, and then from 8:30 to 9, and then 9 to 9:45, each one of those transitions, I need to capture what I'm going from and what I'm going to, and how long I
Mhm.
was working on the previous one. Well, there's tools for time tracking and that sort, but I don't really care for any of those. So what I'd like to do is have some sort of a way from my desktop to just click a button and say what I'm doing now. And I know it's going to capture a timestamp as to when that's recorded, log it into a sheet, in this case, probably SharePoint or something, basic details, and then be able to reconcile that at the end of the day with my um, time billing tool. It's not rocket science, but it also means that I got to dedicate probably 2 to 3 hours to set it up. And
Right.
I have to decide at some point that that 2 to 3 hours is worth spending over just manually doing it or opening my time tracking utility and plugging it in there. And at some point, I'm going to recognize that the value of time that I may have lost in not tracking it is greater than the value or the amount that I would spend to build the tool.
Right.
So that for me is probably actually ironically enough, that's probably what I'm going to build right after here because it's top of mind. So I have that little feature. But that's a perfect example of a problem that can be solved with a simple tool that doesn't have to be 3 weeks in development. It should be able to be something simple, something effective, and move on to the next thing. So automation,
Well,
it can
I
make
will
a
be
huge difference in what you're doing.
I will be very curious how you solve this issue with the baseboard, and I will be, the next one to
Well,
copy you onto that.
let's let's talk about it because hell, it's our show. We'll talk about whatever we want.
Sure.
So that little baseboard, the difficulty I have is a 240-volt baseboard.
Hmm.
So I can't just throw a regular thermostat on it. And if you go on to things like Amazon and you look for thermostatic controls for electric baseboards, they're all the ones that are wired into the house. So they're assuming that you have baseboard heat all through your house, and this is controlling it through your central system. Well, that's not what this is. This doesn't have any wires coming off of it for the thermostat. They're built into the front of it. And if you
Hmm.
look for those little thermostats all you can find are the replacement dial ones, the cut-ons and cut-offs. So I think what I'm going to have to do is get one of the household ones that are battery powered. It doesn't have to be big and fancy, but just the battery powered ones, um, and wire it directly to where the thermostat would be in the baseboard unit. That means then it could control the on off toggle. It's going to act like that thermostatic control. But then I could say, monitor for this temperature. If it's over 68 degrees, don't turn on. If it's
Right.
below 60 degrees, turn on. Um, and I think that would make it much more useful. But what I don't understand in this particular case is why this is a problem that has not been addressed. Should be something fairly simple. But then there's lots of other tools. For the amount of time and effort I could spend doing that, I could just get a wall mounted unit that has an app that goes with it, that I can control it through the app and program it on time and do all kinds of goofy things. And so is it worth the 3 hours of my time that it's probably going to take when all's said and done to get the parts and wire the parts and hook everything up and make sure it works? Or is it worth just spending the $150 to get the wall unit and mount it and be done with it? Eh, It's a it's a dilemma that I think we all have to consider all the time. Is the solution more expensive than the simple fix
Correct.
when we compare it to the value of our time? And that goes back to automation too. Is that little bit of automation time, building the automation, what is the progressive savings we're going to get from that
Hmm.
in the value of our time? And do the math on that. And if you're saving 5 minutes and it's going to take you 2 hours to set the thing up, how long is it going to take to recoup that 2 hours before you start to see a benefit from it?
Correct.
It's going to take a while. Do the math and decide. Sometimes it's worth it, but in many cases, it may be like, maybe not. Although the one thing we didn't talk about with automation, we keep talking about savings. Um, the one thing we didn't talk about is the fact is that an automation, when it runs, will do the task. So a lot of times an automation is a great way just to make sure something gets done. And when you think about things like publishing content or updating a record or things like that, that can sometimes fall through the cracks. And automation is a great way to go through and make sure that that's taken care of. And an example of that was in one of the databases that I had to build. When a project was finished, there was an automation that would say, only the project manager could run the closeout automation.
Right.
And it would go through and update about 7 different fields in the project and put a notation at the end of the project saying this had been closed. So it would update, the close date, who ran the routine, um, transfer some data between some of the columns. Like I said, put that notation, but they only had to push one button to make that happen. But it made sure it got done and it got all the detail necessary for all the other reporting and activities that needed to happen. So a checklist wasn't necessary. And that's a good way to utilize an automation if you're trying to duplicate the equivalent of a checklist of functions. Yeah, that's a great way to trigger it. But as for the baseboard heater, I wish I had a better solution as of yet. I do not.
Well, I can tell you that I don't have a better solution either, but I my issue has been, do I really want to fix that, and then, or do I want to just turn this one off, okay, buy one that has that built in and let it go, because the problem is in many cases it's cheaper.
Yeah, I mean that's the similar thing that I'm thinking is that I could do that. I actually have an air conditioning unit sitting next to the heater. Um, I could go through. I mean, if I think about from an automation standpoint, let's frame it this way. Right now, I have a smart outlet hooked to my air conditioner so that I can tell Madam A to turn the air conditioner on and turn it off. There's no thermostat attached to it. There's nothing like that. But I could conceivably, because if I have the air conditioner, I don't need the heater and vice versa. I could just switch from one to the other
Mhm.
and use a thermostat that could talk to Madam A and say, hey, when the temperature gets below a certain point, trigger a routine in Amazon to then go trigger this smart device, which happens to be turning the heater on. That would work. That functionality is not that hard because that capability is there. Is it worth taking the time to set it up? Could be. That actually could be the best solution. Why? Because what does it gain me then? Well, I can control it from the outside. I can control it from any room in the house. I can make sure it's shut off when I'm away. I can't do that right now. And I can't do it with the solution of the hardwired one. So
Yeah. And
this is one of those things where I kind of have to wonder what can be done.
well, now that we have a project in common, we will be sharing more about the story of the thermostat. But for now,
Oh,
follow
interesting.
us where you like to listen to podcasts, like us, or subscribe to us and leave us a review. You can also interact with us in personalproductivity.club. We have a channel in there, and we are Augusto Pinaud and Art Gelwicks. See you next time on your favorite device. Thank you.